Good evening, little birds. Welcome to the Campfire. I am Caspian Crow, and this is Campfire Stories. A long time ago, before cars, before airplanes, before Airbnbs, there lived a kindly reverend. Now, this reverend had served over 20 churches in his lifetime, and he was on his way to serve another. He had been walking for 5 days along that lonely country road. He was quite weary. Fortunately, he spotted a humble farm up ahead. As was customary at the time, he knocked on the door of the house and asked if he could spend the night in their home. Well, the farmer who greeted him said that they had no room in their house, but he would be happy to let the Reverend stay in an old shack that lay just on the edge of his farmland, backed up against the mountains. The Reverend accepted the kind farmer's offer, and so, after dinner, when they discussed things like the harvest, and community news, and preparations for the long winter ahead, they gathered a good bit of firewood and crossed the fields to that old shack. Now, the shack was not much to look at. It had a small bedroom in a loft up above, a cellar below, and on the ground floor was a simple fireplace and a sturdy chair. A little more. It would suit the Reverend for tonight. And so, after making sure that a good fire was burning and a good bit of wood was left at the side of the fireplace, the farmer left the Reverend to his own devices. Now, by this point, the wind had begun to blow, and clouds were beginning to block even the stars and the moonlight. The Reverend had started hearing things outside, branches scraping up against the windows, rocks tumbling down from the mountains. So, not feeling like he was going to get much sleep, the Reverend decided to sit in front of the fireplace and read for a while. And he did. Eventually, he dozed off. At least it felt like he did. For his watch read close to midnight, and by now, the fire had burned down to just smoldering crimson coals. And now, the sounds that he heard were more intense. The trees scraping against the windows sounded like great beasts clawing at the walls. And the rocks tumbling from the mountains sounded like someone had been dropping boulders right down on the front porch. The Reverend tried to settle himself. He poked the fire with his cane, trying to bring some life into it. And then, a new sound reached his ears, like that of a rooster trying to crow, and then cutting off, as though someone had thrown a rock at it and knocked the crow right out of it. Now, a rooster trying to crow after midnight was surely not a good sign. But at that moment, the Reverend had bigger things to worry about. For just then, he heard a terrible sound. A sound like a young woman screaming and crying as though someone was chasing her. The sound moved through the cellar down below, and then up above. The Reverend stepped back against the wall, held his cane in front of him like a club, and said, "What do you want?" And then he heard footsteps moving, slow, measured, towards the door of the shack. The Reverend stared at the shack and he said, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, what do you want?" And at that moment, the door burst open, and he was knocked against the wall by a fierce wind. there, in the doorway, he spied a young woman. A young woman with stringy, dark hair. A pale complexion with sunken cheeks. This alone would have been strange, but when he looked into the eyes, he saw empty sockets staring at him. And before he could question her further, she was suddenly in front of him, and he could feel the aroma of cold, damp, freshly dug earth forcing itself in his nostrils. And the specter looked at him and said, "I want to be buried. My sweetheart killed me for my money and buried me beneath the hearthstone in front of the fireplace. I want you to dig up my bones and give me a proper church burial. All except for one tiny finger bone. Once you've done that, gather everybody in town for a great supper. And when all are finished, pass the plate around with my finger bone on it. And when it comes to the one that killed me, that finger bone will point to that person, and you will know who it was that did the deed." And with that, before the Reverend could ask anything else, the woman sobbed and sank below the floor, and all was quiet. Well, needless to say, sleep was difficult after that. Still, the Reverend found some rest, and in the morning, he spoke to that farmer and told him what happened. And wouldn't you know it, that farmer said, "I'd heard there was a haunt out there in that shack, but I'd never believed it. You being a preacher, though, I guess I believe it now." Well, after taking a moment to process that information, the Reverend and the farmer came up with a plan, and they made an agreement that for an equal share of the treasure, the farmer would help the Reverend find that poor young woman's killer. And so, together, they went back out to the shack. They carefully lifted the hearthstones and dug into the earth, and there were the bones of that poor young girl. Very carefully, reverently even, they gathered those bones, took them to the nearby churchyard, and buried them. They sang some songs, and the Reverend would later recall that it was the best funeral he had ever given. Then, once that was done, they gathered everyone in town for a grand supper. And everybody arrived, and there was more food than they knew what to do with. Everyone ate their fill, and there was still more besides. Once everyone sat back, the Reverend brought forth a covered tray. When he removed the cover, everyone at the table gasped, for there, sitting on the tray, was that one tiny finger bone. And as instructed, without explaining why, the Reverend passed that plate around the table. All the way around it went. All the villagers questioning, but following the Reverend's instructions until it almost made its way all the way around the table. For a moment, the Reverend thought that nothing was going to come of this, but then it reached a kind-looking old man, sitting not far from the Reverend himself, and when the plate reached him, the finger bone twitched, and it twitched again, and then it shot from the plate, jamming itself right against that old man's vest. Well, was in shock, and they questioned what was happening, how this had happened, what this meant. And the more they questioned, the more flustered and frustrated the old man got, until finally he growled, I killed that girl. I killed her for her money. I never did find it, though. Well, the people at the table were appalled and enraged by this callous disregard for such an innocent life. And so, they took the man. They took him to the nearest tree and they hanged him right there. The Reverend gave him his last rites and said a few extra words for his soul. Nothing more could be done. The girl had finally had justice. The next day, the Reverend went back out to that shack, and that same spectral figure rose from the ground. But instead of sobbing, this time she thanked the Reverend for bringing her killer to justice and bringing rest to her soul. She told him where she had hidden the gold. Then she vanished into thin air, now finding peace beyond this world. Well, the Reverend and the farmer went out into the fields and dug up that gold, and it was more gold than they had ever seen in their lives. And as promised, the Reverend split it evenly with that farmer, and then went on his way. And over the next several years, the Reverend lived quite happily, continuing to serve his community despite his riches. For if there was anything he learned from that night, it's that all the gold in the world cannot replace good company and friends that you make along the way. Thank you for joining me in the campfire, little birds. I'm Caspian Crow, and I bid you good nightmare.